Okay, great. I'm going to begin. Well, good morning, Tanche, bonjour everyone, to all our listeners on Presenting Our Presence. As you know, Presenting Our Presence is a new podcast out of the University of Alberta, co-hosted with Florence Glanfield, myself, and with Kyle Napier, our colleague, who will also be joining us today. So welcome, and we're so excited today. I'm Dr. Janice Cindy Guadet. I'm an assistant professor at Campus Saint-Jean, also Canada Research Chair. Today, we're happy to have our friend and our colleague, Dr. Chris Andersen. And again, Presenting Our Presence is about a podcast that highlights Indigenous peoples and knowledge at the University of Alberta. And this came to be through Florence Glanfield's amazing leadership with our virtual teas and the inspiration of just sitting around the table, visiting, sharing who we are, what we do, and just how amazing and how many of us are at the University of Alberta. And so today, Chris Andersen, who has been at the U of A, Chris, oh my God, 20 years.
25 years.
25 years. So you've seen many things, a lot of changes. You were probably, oh my God, 20, we won't say how young you were, but certainly a place that informed who you are, what you do, and also the ways that you are leading, taking this beautiful leadership role at the Faculty of Métis Studies as our Dean. We're so proud of you. And so I'll pass it to you. Welcome, and tell us who you are, who you belong to, what's important to you, and even your theme that you want to share with us today that we discussed a couple weeks ago.
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for the invite. Very much appreciate it. As you said, Chris Andersen, I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Métis Studies here at the University of Alberta. I've been at the U of A for 25 years. I came in 96 to start my PhD and just kind of never left after that. I often joke that I'm living proof of what happens to mediocrity. If it kind of hangs around long enough, it kind of floats up to the middle. So I'm right in the middle of going for my second term as a dean right now, the reappointment process. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it'll go well. I'm originally from the Parkland region of Saskatchewan. I spent most of my childhood growing up in Prince Albert. My last name is Andersen, but I come from a big Arcand family, kind of in the Prince Albert and slightly more northerly region. I come from a family of musicians and artists. One of my uncles is John Arcand, runs a big fiddle fest outside of Saskatoon. But my another Uncle Ralph, used to have a band. I'm not sure what's going on with COVID, but used to have a band called Bannock Country that played a lot of old time dances and whatnot. And I have tons of cousins that are super musical, and tons of relatives that do a lot of different kinds of artistic work as well. I left Saskatchewan in 1990 to go to Queen's University. I actually went to play football. I didn't even know it was a good university until I got there. And then turns out I was a shitty football player, but not a bad student. And so did my undergrad and my master's there. Wanted to come back west, closer to home. So I got a PhD offer to come to the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. And so I started my PhD here in 1996 and then got hired as a professor in 1999. I deferred it for a year to finish my PhD. And then, of course, it took me another 5 years to finish my PhD, but I got hired on as a full-time professor in 2000. And I've spent my entire career in the Faculty of Métis Studies.
Wow. It's so interesting to hear kind of the trajectory of our journeys, and where we come from and where we go and where it takes us. And I haven't been to John Arcand's Fiddle Fest, but every year I see it come up. I think of you, and I think about, how important it is when we kind of come together in those special special places and gatherings that is just embedded with all things Métis. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about your PhD, what did you study? What was your theme of your PhD, doctoral studies?
Well, originally I was a quantitative sociologist. So my master's degree was a logistic regression analysis of regional victimization rates in Canada. Yeah, it's as interesting as it sounds. And then when I came to do my PhD, what I was originally going to do it on was looking at the impact of racism on stop checks that the police were doing and to see to what extent racism played a role in Indigenous vehicle drivers getting stopped that would lead ultimately to some type of infraction or ticket or check us for warrants or whatever, that kind of thing. But after I did 2 more statistics courses when I was doing my coursework for my PhD, both of which were these what are called LISREL courses, linear structural equation modeling courses, which is basically as kind of hoity-toity fancy as you can get or could get at the time as an academic. And I did not find it interesting. I loved my professor who taught me. He was amazing, but there was too many questions that weren't being answered by the statistics that I was doing. And at the same time, I ended up taking a reading course with a professor who at the time was at the Faculty Saint-Jean, Claude Denis, who's now at University of Ottawa. And I fell in love with discourse analysis. And so I was sort of searching around for a project. And then one of my cousins got fined for shooting a deer. He was paraplegic, but he'd set up his van with a kind of a gun or a shooting setup so he could roll his chair appropriately into the van and shoot from his van. And as I understand it, shooting from your vehicle was illegal at the time in terms of hunting for food. And so I was waiting for his court case to come to an outcome of some kind, but there wasn't enough information that was part of it that I could really do a dissertation out of it. And at the same time, the Pali situation had happened in Sault Ste. Marie. And so I started reading into some of the original documentation around the original Pali decision. I started reading some of the appeal decisions, the appeal Pali decisions, and started looking at some of the intervenor factums and expert reports. And it just seemed super, super, super ripe for analysis to look at the way in which a term like Métis was being racialized in the court. So not talked about in terms of our nationalism, but talked about in terms of our mixed Indigenous, non-Indigenous ancestry. And so that's what I ended up doing my dissertation on, was on the Pali decision. And then parts of that ended up being in my first book technically I guess it was my second book, but my first sole author book that I published, which came out in 2012, which is called very originally just called Métis. And so I got really interested in it, and to a certain extent I'm still interested in now why so many people call themselves Métis when they're not, and why people get so defensive when you ask them what makes them Métis, and they give you these answers that don't make any sense from a nationhood perspective. And so I think over the past 15 years, most of my research, I've done other kinds of stuff. I've done research in urban Indigenous relations. I've done research on kind of what is Indigenous studies as an emerging discipline. But kind of my heart work has been in the context of critiquing racialized understandings of what it means to be Métis.
Well, your research work and your book that you released was certainly kind of helping to kind of think through the identity in a whole new way through that peoplehood lens. And I think that's really been foundational in terms of Métis identity. And it's interesting because growing up also in Saskatchewan and thinking about Métis identity was that piece of just that whole racialized element kind of part of your everyday or interactions or life there in the prairies or life in Saskatchewan, or these institutional structures of racism and how it affects that profiling or the racialization?
Oh, 100%. It's, a lot of people go to university and they sort of have epiphanies about who they are because they live in a context that allows for those kinds of epiphanies. I think when I was growing up, I think what university did to me that my childhood didn't do to me particularly was politicize my understanding of Métis identity. Because from my perspective, when I thought of myself as Métis growing up, it was always in the context of extended family. I never really thought kind of more broadly or even particularly historically outside of my family context. Everything for me growing up, when I thought about it at all, was not about what being Métis meant in terms of a connection to Gabriel Dumont or Louis Riel. Although I do find that families either kind of dig Gabriel Dumont or Louis Riel. It's rare that you find families that kind of dig both sides. But for me, it was all about being an arcand, and it was all about kind of like the crazy shit that my aunties and uncles did. And I remember once, because we went to Métis fairly often when I was a kid, and one year they had a T-shirt that said, "I'm Métis, what's your excuse?" And it had that famous picture of Gabriel Dumont on it on a horse. And for me, as I think about it, as I think back on it now, it's always been about being Métis. For me, it has always been about, and still is, but of course I've got this additional political element to it now, but it's always been about irreverence. It's always been about, making the best with what you have. It's always been about kind of adding humor to things that otherwise, it's all been about kind of rising above the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and finding dignity where it exists in the context of those circumstances. And when I think about my kokam, and I think about my mama, and I think about the kinds of relationships that I had with them growing up, it's always in the context of kind of, shrugging off those indignities. And I think living in a racialized context that we, like the kind that we lived in and live in Western Canada, is all about, it's about a whole bunch of different things. There's violence, there's all of this different kind of stuff. I'm not discounting any of that, but I often think about the many indignities that we're forced to deal with. Just these, like this, just day-to-day bullshit that we have to deal with. Somebody, emails me at the University of Alberta who's an ally to Indigenous peoples, and their signature line says that they're on Treaty 6 territory, and mentions nothing about being on Métis territory. Like just those tiny little kinds of erasure that we deal with on a daily basis. And so from my perspective, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in doing work on Métis identity is because I see the racialization of Métis identity as a form of erasure that we put up with from the feds, from the province, from well-meaning non-Indigenous people, and let's be honest, even from people in our own communities that themselves have very racialized understandings of what it means to be Métis. Colonialism is a really powerful, even elementally powerful force, and we're no more immune to it just because we are ourselves Métis than people who aren't. And so I think from my perspective, that's what's always, like I often tell students, if you want to pick a topic to do research on, figure out something that pisses you off or irritates you, and then figure out how to get excited about it kind of theoretically and methodologically. But there should always be that pinprick at the beginning for thinking about why you want to do what you want to do. And 3 or 4 months ago, I made a decision to move all of my research away from just the identity stuff that I was doing and move it into Métis health and well-being. And so now I think kind of more broadly in terms of what the relationship between identity and well-being is, and what the relationship intergenerationally is between identity and well-being.
Well, that's exciting because I got this whole piece. As you know, a lot of my research is in community, with community. I'm meeting with a lot of aunties and elders, and that's something that's not a question that's ever discussed. What does it mean to be Métis? Okay, It's kind of like there's not that kind of having to theorize or think it through, because as you know, they're just they're living it. I love that image of just that passing, the dignity piece, like how, and it just reminds me of my mom and my aunties, and also how they say to me, do you ever have fun? Like you're thinking too much, and do you ever give your mind a break? And so that's what I sometimes find about the complexities of the academy when we're trying to make sense or meaning of this identity piece within the academic structure. So the work you do is so vital to give that theoretical conversation around identity.
Yeah, I don't know how vital my work is, but I do know that when you think about some of the stuff that Jennifer Adese is doing, or you think about the work that Audra Simpson does, or the work that Jill Doeffler does around kind of getting us to think beyond self-identification and start to think in terms of citizenship, I think that's really where we need to go in terms of how we theorize about this kind of stuff. I'm up to here about people using self-identification as the major or even the only dynamic in identity making, and it's something that happens particularly in the academy. It can't really happen to the same degree at home because people know you. People know who you are. People know who your relations are. It can happen in urban spaces. It happens all the time in urban spaces because there's an anonymity in that context that you don't get when you are at some place where you're connected through genealogy and kinship and family relations to that particular place. But the academy is the place where everybody sort of peacocks their identity in particular ways as well. Like, I introduce myself as Métis when I'm in Western Canada, but I always introduce myself as Métis if I go anywhere into Ontario, because I have no idea what the term Métis means when someone uses it in Ontario. And I thought that was a little kind of snooty when I first started doing it, but then I was talking with one of my uncles, and he was saying before English came into communities, we always talked about ourselves as Limachif. So this wasn't sort of he said it was only with the Constitution coming in 82 that people started talking about Métis. And at the time I'd asked him, oh, interesting. So before Métis came in, you just called yourself half-breeds. And he said, well, I mean, sometimes, but mostly it was Limachif. So from his perspective, that was the way that he grounded himself to place. And so I get frustrated by the extent to which we value self-identification in the academy. And in doing so, we downplay the need to think about relationality and our kind of connection to citizenship. And I think one of the things that the university does well and also gets wrong as it's doing it well is that we have taken a genealogical focus on what it means to be Métis and not a kinship focus on what it means to be Métis. So we think about, someone will say, well, I'm from so-and-so family, so-and-so family, so-and-so family. And I immediately now think, as I kind of approach the age of 50, I immediately think, okay, but who are you actually connected to? I have no interest in who you say you're genealogically connected to. Who do you have ongoing relationships with, right? Because there's a bunch of non-Indigenous ancestors that, of course, you're connected to. You're not mentioning any of those. You're only talking about the Métis one. So who are you in ongoing relationship with? And 100% there are complications to this. If someone is not cisgendered, if someone is queer, if someone is transgendered, et cetera, there's all kinds of structural inequities that exist in our communities that might make it difficult for somebody with those subject vectors to have ongoing relationships. Full respect, understand that. But for most people, if you're going to make a claim to something, do the work to actually build and maintain the connection, and don't just make the claim. Figure out what it means to sit with the discomfort of reconnecting to your family members and your extended family members.
Sure. Such a good point. I remember listening to a talk, or I can't remember who it was or what context, but it was like the hard work of showing up at the door and knocking and going visiting again.
And being told in some cases to piss off.
Yeah.
Nobody cares that I'm a professor when I go back home. Nobody cares that I'm a dean. Like they're happy that I've done well with my life, but I gave books out to family members. Most of them, they never cracked it. And why would I expect them to crack it? It wasn't written for them.
That's right. So this, Chris, you bring such an important piece in terms of the navigation of academia and identity and the tensions, and also when we're working with communities. So something that I often think about, because you speak about your book and you're like, well, you didn't write it for family, and they don't, it's true. It's like, yes, our families are proud, our communities, but I mean, we're not talking about our doctorates and that kind of work that we're doing. However, we carry it with us in some sense always. And in the writing, I'm always thinking, which can be tedious in my own process, is who am I writing for? Because when I do speak about how Sophie McDougall speaks about this, makes me think about Auntie as reconstituting our health and well-being, or Doris, all these aunties that are in their 80s. And I sit and I review every chapter with them. And therefore, I have to be super thoughtful about the ways in which I write,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to write for community. I want to write with community. And so that creates this whole kind of tension of this academic rigor, you know, and the ways in which we perceive our writing or our research work. And yet I feel that there's room for, which increasingly with Indigenous scholarship, there's room for that within the academy.
Yeah, I would say I do not try and write. Okay, this is going to sound kind of this is going to sound a bit trite, but I don't try and write for community unless I'm specifically writing for community. So when I write a book like Métis, it wasn't written for my family, it wasn't written for community, it was written for other scholars in the academy who continue to racialize our identity. So I wanted it as a clarion call to other people that are going to work in the area, not just of Métis studies, but kind of Indigenous scholarship more generally. So from that perspective, it was kind of like I was trying to clear some epistemological debris, and hopefully people would kind of start from a more, again, I use this word a lot, but from a more dignified position in terms of what they think about the term Métis as meaning. And if you change what you think the term Métis means, then you have to change what you think the term Indigenous means. There's no way around it. There's no way to kind of take a more nationhood-centered understanding of Métis and not take a more nationhood-based understanding of First Nations. So I think that if I'm going to write with community, and I haven't done a lot of it, I've done some of it, I don't know that I would actually write with community. I think because the 20th century in particular was such an ocular-centric century, like, you know, visual century, I think when you are doing something for and with community, you have a much greater opportunity to open up the representational form that you use to communicate with them and the audience that you're communicating with. So you think in terms of like video stories, you think in terms of digital storytelling, you think in terms of adding in music, you think in terms of all these different kinds of things that you could do in an academic context, but you probably wouldn't, certainly not at least until you had tenure. I'm a big believer that universities can do good things, that we can change the world with the positions that we have in the academy, as long as we have the humility to understand that we don't get to decide on our own what it means to change the world in a good way, that we do that in partnership with communities in ways where we learn from the experts and the wise people in communities while we're doing it. I have no interest in being kind of an anthropologist going into community with all of the answers, because you know better than I do that very often when you go into community with a particular research project, that may not be the reason why community is letting you into the community to do the research project. They have their own kind of ideas about why they want you doing what you're doing. And it could also often be asymptotic, right? The two could get closer and closer together but never meet. So how can you kind of engage with each other to make use of each other's kind of expertise and resources and those kinds of things? So yeah, if I was to work with community, I'm not sure writing with community would be the tack I would take, unless community wanted to write. And then in which case you figure out kind of who your partners are and go from there. And then you kind of, you get involved in this painstaking process of, like, for example, about 10 or 11 years ago, I did a plain language summary of Statistics Canada's 2006 community profile on Edmonton, because nobody could understand what the hell all those different tables meant. And so I actually met with people to create this pamphlet to make it a more plain language, less idiomatic, easier for people who wanted to be able to use this stuff to write grants for the community organizations that they work with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A very, very different process than the kind of process you would go through if you were writing something to get other scholars to think more broadly, or to think in more dignified ways, more nuanced ways about shit that people otherwise just take for granted as being true. So I'm rambling a lot here, but your question has really made me think about kind of like, what are the limits of the representational form of actually writing? and how well does that suit community? In some cases, it might suit it very well. Many of our community members have university degrees, have worked in organizations for a long time. They can translate between different idioms, but in other cases, it might not. This is why the engagement becomes so important, to figure out, well, what is it that they want? What kinds of things what does community engagement look like from a dissemination standpoint?
So important, because I'm rethinking the process of community engagement, and I'm re-examining these questions. So I think that's so this conversation is helpful for me to think through about that piece. What does it suit for community? And therefore also not possessing that possessive piece, just which can become easily conflated within the university and the academy, as well as Indigenous scholars as well.
100%.
Because it proclaims itself as that.
And also you get evaluated on it.
That's right.
Yeah. So what does it mean for you to publish a piece in which you're the ninth author? Even though it might have taken you far more time to do it, working out those ethical relationships with people that you're writing with, than it would be just to rip off a 15-page article that you send off to. Not that a 15-page article isn't difficult to do. It certainly can be, but it's easier to do it on your own than it is to do it with other people. And that's even with other scholars, let alone community members who've got different ideas about what's important.
Kyle, I know you had some thoughts you wanted to share with Chris. We both listened to your talk that you provided at Western. And so that's evoked some questions for both of us as we're talking about. Kyle, I'll pass it to you.
Sure, yeah, and thank you, Cindy, and thank you also, Chris, for sharing a bit more about the context behind not only your research and your work, but even like modes of understanding. This is a really kind of rich topic for me, and there's a lot that I'm kind of tethering it to. So just really, appreciating this. So I have a question here based on your decades of time spent at the University of Alberta and in your own different roles, right? As student, as teacher, as staff, as in all of these different roles, is that you've likely seen others grow into those types of experiences, from students to instructors to staff, or whatever route they may have taken. So I'm just curious about your own thoughts on identity and belonging as it relates to other people's journeys, particularly on campus. What types of stories have you seen, or if there was a lack of connection to belonging, did that lead to people being able to participate less on campus, or if there was more of a sense of community, or people feeling like there's more support around them? Did they feel like they were able to share more of their identity, or be more of themselves?
Yeah, it's a good and complicated question. I think there's a creative tension between students who might have had a fairly kind of unthumbtacked understanding of who they were, because as kids you don't get to pick where your parents live when you grow up. So who knows what kind of relationships you've had with extended family and community. When you come to university, in a space of learning like a university, you're incredibly vulnerable in terms of first you've got to admit that you don't know particular things. And then on top of that, you start getting different viewpoints of things that you've never thought about before. So sometimes that's like, holy smokes, it's going to take me a second here to figure that out. So I think there's a tension between managing and protecting that vulnerability on one side, and not allowing discussions about the importance of connecting to someone other than yourself as being a basis of the claims that people are making, right? So, like a part of what I wrote in my book way back when was, I said 2012, I think the book came out in 2014, actually. So 7 years ago, was thinking about, okay, so let's just do a conceptual experiment here. In your mind, both Cindy and you, Kyle, but all of our minds, what's the difference between an Indigenous person with white ancestry and a white person with Indigenous ancestry? Because both things can exist, and both things can exist in the same person. So how do we make differentiations between those two things? Well, for me, it's about people's ability to connect with, in some kind of ongoing relationship with some entity other than themselves. Ideally family, ideally community. Sometimes for some people, it may be kind of an urban community because that's all they have open or available to them, or that's where they feel most comfortable with kind of who they present themselves to be. That's totally fine. But just in terms of thinking about how do we move beyond self-identification as the basis for our discussions about identity. And in fact, one of the things that I talked about in my book was how do we actually move away from using identity at all? Like, what words can we use instead of identity? Because very often the term identity gets used for social relations that are completely at odds with each other. So we might think about kind of like our situated self-understanding on one side, and we might think about state categorizations on the other side, but both of those get collapsed together in the term identity. So what terminology would we use rather than identity if we were going to talk about our kind of self-making through social interaction, which is the way that some identity theorists talk about identity when they actually try and define it. And it is how do we navigate that kind of tenderness of vulnerability on the one side and that kind of white possessiveness on the other side, because those are two kind of discourses that circulate with each other, and it's tricky. There's no magic formulas here. There's certainly no kind of easy solutions to this, but it's willing to sit with that discomfort and the willingness to kind of move through that trauma rather than pretending it doesn't exist. That can become a place of creative and fruitful discussions about the complexity of these kinds of things. And I would say that part of the issue that we have in talking about these kinds of things is we treat them too simplistically, and we're not willing to attend to nuance. We're not willing to attend to complexity. And I often say in Indigenous studies that Indigenous studies in particular is the exact opposite of most academic disciplines. Most academic disciplines take things that seem really complex and they break them down into easier understand chunks so that people can understand them. Indigenous studies does the opposite. We take things that seem simple and break them down into more complex chunks to make them easier to understand. And I think identity is one of those things that needs to be broken down into more complex chunks.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I'll pass it to you if you have another kind of reflection you want to leave us with.
Just a big masicho kinanaskumtin for sharing your words, Chris, and for sharing the space and the time and for holding space for those conversations that are spicy, as you've said, that do challenge hegemony, that do challenge even people who have like you said proposed binaries when there's kind of multimodal dynamic complex answers way beyond just a this or that problem or solution. So Chris, just thank you again for your time and a lot of room for reflection here, a lot of room to saturate. So I'll be here steeping like a tea with your words. So thank you.
Well, thanks to you both for the invite. It's very kind and appreciated. And if anyone who eventually listens to this has any further questions, they can feel free to contact me by email as well.
Awesome. Well, merci. And thanks for being you, and thanks for being real, and thanks for creating the space, like Kyle said, that we can have these conversations, get uncomfortable, be uncomfortable, stretch. I was nervous before the call. I'm like, oh my God, Chris, I listened to his talk. It's way beyond. And I wanted to ask him about this and that, but this was perfect. And
that's great. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, great. To be continued.
Absolutely.
We're recording. Great.
And yeah, no worries. It's an informal recording process too. So the idea is to get comfortable. But
yeah, it's always informal until this goes public.
Until it goes public. Yeah.
Right. It don't matter how formal or informal it is while we're doing it. It's the impact afterwards, eh?
That's just it. Yeah. Okay.
Like,
So
how much can we cut?